Welcome to the 11th episode of the Women in CX podcast, a series dedicated to real talk conversations between women in customer experience. Listen in as we share our career stories, relive the moments that shaped us, and voice our opinions as loudly as we like about all manner of CX subjects. I'll be your host, Clare Muscutt, and in today's episode we'll be talking about one woman's journey from the days before CX was even a thing and her vision to unite web design and usability. Let me introduce you to today's inspiring guest. She comes all the way from the home of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, California, and during her 25 plus years working as a woman in tech, she spent time with a variety of companies including Microsoft, startups and her own business, and is now the Director of Creative Services at boutique management consultancy Beyond the Arc. Please welcome to the show, CX sister, Gavin James. Hey Gavin.
Hey, good morning.
How are you?
Fabulous. How are you?
Fantastic to hear, and thank you so much to all the listeners. So Gavin, let's get straight in there, shall we?
Sure.
Great. So I don't know if you remember, but when we met during lockdown, it was just at the time around George Floyd's murder and the world was going crazy, and you and I connected over this sense of the social injustice, but also the need for connection, right?
Sure.
So I think I just would really love to kind of go back to where we left that conversation, where we started talking about, for us personally, we had this shared experience of our greatest lessons coming not from the awesome times where we were really successful, but actually through some of the difficulties. And if that's okay with you,
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. So I love your mantra of putting a lot of love in and wanting a lot of love back. And I think that topic would be a really great starting point for today. So let's go. Okay. But before we begin, actually, I'm sure the listeners are all wondering, I doubt they've met a girl called Gavin either, and I never had. Please do tell, what is the story behind your name, Gavin?
Well, I can thank my warrior mom. She grew up with a Scottish grandmother and kind of learned to love everything about Celtic history. And Gavin is a famous Celtic warrior. I think he was one of the Knights of the Round Table. And she had always said, I think I knew you'd be a special baby. You have to have a special name, and I'm going to give you a warrior name, and I know you can live up to it.
Love it.
So I hope I have.
Yeah, that's so cool. And did you grow up getting asked that question constantly? Why are you called Gavin?
Most people would say that's a boy's name, and that was
Yeah.
always kind of frustrating. But I don't think I ever confused anyone in person.
No.
There was definitely lots of times, in a working environment that you only deal with people in email, right? And then I'd show up in their office and they'd say, "And you are?" And I'd go, "I'm Gavin."
Yeah, I have to say, I think that would have fooled me. I would have made the assumption that Gavin was probably going to be a boy. So I know you've got a really inspiring career story. You started out at Microsoft. You started your own tech company and eventually struck out on your own as a consultant. How exactly did that path evolve, and what did you learn about yourself along the way?
Well, it actually started a lot of years, probably 20 years even before Microsoft, doing a lot of different things in the earliest days of tech, which really kind of dates me. But and then going into dropping out of that, I'd learned a lot about running small businesses and decided to go into launched a children's clothing company when I was working for a tech startup that went under, and I'd always been involved in the design side of the house, in addition to the writing side. Then I had this children's clothing company for 4 years, and that taught me very quickly that this is not about designing this cute thing, which we also learned that in CX too. It is about marketing and project management. And you have to get that right. And sometimes you have to just learn what you learn along the way and try to, fight the good fight, right? So after killing myself doing that for 4 years, I decided I wanted to go back into tech. But at that point, the internet was just getting started, and I knew that I couldn't just do writing. It would have to be really creative. So I taught myself everything about web design and graphic tools as they became available and all that stuff. And that was how I ended up started working with a tech startup that was doing web animation at the very, very beginning of this. They were bought by Microsoft, so that's how I got to Microsoft.
No way.
And I had a number, so then I went to Microsoft and I had a couple of careers there. At first, mostly on the writing side of the house, where I managed all the user assistants for our software product. And even then, I was starting to see, like, you can't just be focused on the technology. You have to be focused on the user. I was responsible for making sure people could figure out how to learn and use this stuff. And I could basically work with the developers and say, this is going to be too much words for me to talk about it, to explain it, and too hard for anyone to learn it. That means we're going to have to adjust to make it more usable. Well, usability was kind of the problem child back then. This is the earliest days when it was never even called customer experience, and I was really kind of trying to fight that good fight. So then after a while, I left that group and decided I wanted to work on the design side of the house and help with information design and say, okay, how can we make it easier for people to learn and use these things by making information, just really understanding how people take in information, how they're emotionally feeling about things when they're going through a learning process, which happens every day in CX now, right? Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of research to build out a bunch of innovative ideas. And my boss at the time had been at the company for 20 years. And she said, hey, present this out to a bunch of leadership. So I did. And everyone kind of had sort of glazed over eyes. And I talked to my boss after that, and she said, this is really cool, but it's about 5 years ahead of its time. Nobody's ready for it yet.
Wow.
And I thought, you know what? I know this is important, and I know it's going to be a thing. And that is where I'm headed. And 20 years later, being empathetic customer experience is what everybody's talking about, right? Mm. So that's kind of what started me on this path. There was also a lot of negative dramas that happened being in an environment where it's really about ego and empire building, which I'm sure a lot of us, particularly women in CX, have encountered, right? So that was kind of one of the things that's pinged my mantra. But then right after that, I went and helped launch a tech startup. And, we're all killing ourselves 7 days a week and everything. But then eventually the CEO and founder, he kind of gets a Napoleon complex and doesn't want to listen to anybody when we're saying, hey, this is unusable. We're never going to be able to sell this. It's great technology. It's too complicated. Wouldn't listen to anybody. Basically, I get scapegoated. Saying, well, there must be something wrong. I'm not training well enough, or I'm not marketing it well enough, or whatever. It's somehow my fault. It's not the software's fault. So I decided, you know what, screw that. I'm going to go and do my own thing, because I know that I'm not making this up. I'm not dreaming this. And so when I left there, that was kind of where I decided, you know what, I do put a lot of love in, and I want a lot of love back. I put the best of I brought a lot to the table. I brought a lot of value to the table, a lot of good experience. And there were people around me who agreed with me. But clearly I was working in an environment with people that just didn't honor that. And I'm sure that a lot of people, but especially women, yourself included, has encountered that, right? So when I set that mantra, I decided that has to be the true north on my compass. And it's not just, it's how I get treated. It's the kind of clients I attract. It's the kind of work I get to do. It's how I get compensated. It's that I don't have to chase clients to pay the bill, that they're going to be fine paying me, as a consultant. That's mission critical, right? So that's kind of brought me full circle to, a lot of the consulting that I do today. And fortunately, setting that mantra has served me well, because now it's been 15 years and it's always worked for me.
So much that resonated with me and what you talked about then. I guess it's really cool to meet somebody that was there kind of at the beginning, at the birth of some of these technologies that have shaped the world as they are today. And I can imagine being told, I've been told myself, you're way before your time with some of my CX thinking. I can imagine what that must have been like for you, kind of before CX was even a thing, saying, if you can unite product design and coding and usability, as it was called then, together, we could make something that will sell, Mr. CEO. And then being kind of minimized by that person. Must have been, I guess, really difficult at that time because, well, for a number of reasons, but also because there was nobody else out there, I guess, with the same point of view as you. Whereas now there's loads of us that talk about CX, right? And if we can share those frustrations with each other, but I can imagine at the time that must have been really difficult for you. So you said that, I think, just maybe to kind of clarify, that is that since you discovered your own true north and you let it guide you, what that's attracted is great energy and the right people that you want to work with, but it's also prevented a lot of negative stuff, like, for example, people not paying you or not being kind in terms of their terms. Is that right?
Well, yes, and it doesn't mean that I was immune, right? I definitely had some really challenging times. One of the other lessons that I had learned was really paying close attention to how people communicate in their earliest communications when you first start dealing with someone. And I'll go out on a limb here and say I think women are a little bit better with the intuition side of the house, so we detect that a little bit better. But we also trying to be nice, peacekeepers, get along, do all that stuff. We let a lot of things slide, right? But in those earliest communications, I learned to really pay attention, because if there was something off, if you felt like they weren't very considerate, they were flaky, or they were condescending, or whatever it was, right? They were showing you what it's going to be like to work with them, to deal with them. And that was always right. And on a few occasions, though, there was an exception where I've met people that I call shapeshifters. And that was, the people that are really super nice to your face, but they're trying to get something for nothing. They're trying to get a lot of your goodwill out of you. But then all of a sudden, they're not really coming through with paying you or whatever. And I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs encounter this. And the trick is to recognize it very early on. That was another painful lesson, because I'd realize, okay, I know my worth. I got to own my worth and not be giving away something for nothing, unless I'm knowingly going in to do like a pro bono thing to help someone, right? And that's, again, as an entrepreneur in particular, but as a woman in business, you have to learn not to, I hate to say be a victim, but not to let your generous spirit and your good nature and your sense of wanting to keep the peace with everybody, right? You don't want to let that overtake what's really a better sound business decision, which is, recognizing, and your intuition says something's off here. This is not healthy for me and not healthy for my business. So, I'm not going to go down that road.
Yeah. It's definitely something that you get wise to through painful experience. I don't know if you saw the post that I shared on LinkedIn this week about someone doing exactly that to me in my first year in business. They convinced me to work without a purchase order on a project that was worth 80,000. And then about week 4, started sexually harassing me, started sending me like naughty messages and stuff. When I told them to stop, they pulled the plug, took the work I'd done, and didn't give me a cent, not a penny. But because I didn't have any contracts in place, or I didn't have a leg to stand on. But that taught me a hell of a lot about protecting yourself with clear contracts and boundaries. But also, like, there was loads of red flags right from the start with the guy, and I just ignored them. My intuition didn't. I was like, I could see the prize of the money. I just ignored the warning signs because I was so keen to get the work. But never again will I.
It's too big of a price to pay, right? I mean, some of my biggest life lessons at this point in my life, I'm 20 years out of you, right? And I'm seeing that the price I've paid for not listening to my intuition. It wasn't that I didn't see it. A lot of people say, oh, wow, I didn't even know it was coming. It's like, no, that's not it. I saw it. I knew. But either I let other things outweigh it, or maybe I thought, oh, well, I can handle it. But your intuition never lies. And that's just one of those things that comes up even in business with clients. There was definitely times where intuition also is a valuable gift a value add you're bringing to the table with a client, because sometimes I think I'm spending more time talking clients out of something than into it, because they think, hey, we heard about X and we think we really need to do this. But then you want to talk with them and say, and even in CX, you say, in theory, that's a fantastic road to take, right? But this is what it's going to involve. Do you really have the time and resources to make this happen? Because if you don't, then you may be doing your business a disservice, because you may not be able to show up in a way that is going to be meaningful for customers. And that will end up making you look worse.
I get you. So thinking about kind of your journey to where you are now and making those difficult decisions, listening to your intuition, that kind of thing. I'd read in the chapter that you wrote for a book about the point in your life where you decided to end your marriage and return to San Francisco. What made you decide to put yourself first in that scenario? Because I think for a lot of women, the prospect of walking away from that amount of security and settlement with another human, I know the conversations I have is that's a very frightening prospect, even if it's the right thing to do. What was that like for you?
I think for me, what comes to mind is there's a line in one of my favorite movies, Out of Africa. And at one point, she's kind of trying to coax him into her desire for marriage, and he's a very free spirit. He says, I don't want to wake up one day and find I'm at the end of someone else's life. And I really came to that point of seeing, there's that point where, especially as women, I think we want to, it's very slippery slope between giving of ourselves without giving up ourselves. And I definitely had crossed over that boundary too much for myself, where I'm feeling like I'm living this other person's life. I'm helping him solve all of his problems and running my own show. And I sort of felt like, okay, I've paid my dues. I've done this long enough. I don't think this needs to be my job for the next 50 years, right? I don't want to have a different kind of life I want to be living, and this is not it. Wow. So we had talked about moving back to California for a long time, just to be somewhere warmer. We were living in Seattle, and I was pretty miserable there. But he kept prolonging it, and I just knew that when I got back into California was that I was happy here. I was never happy up there. And I could see that I was probably never going to be happy in that situation. And there's a point where, as you say, you finally decide it's great to love other people, but sometimes you have to love yourself just a little bit more, and you have to choose yourself. And that idea that I don't want to end up being at the end of someone else's life is a scary thought, and ironically, in my next relationship I got into, I kind of started out, to be the love of my life and amazing. And then I ended up again in a situation that was probably the final karmic lesson that I would ever have to learn. If I had to go through that to learn the karmic lesson and never repeat it in this lifetime or any other, I've done
it. Those karmic lessons, I'm so familiar with them, because you end up having been in that position of pain again and going, oh shit, that's the same lesson that I learned in that situation, or with this guy or whatever. And I'm the same. The toughest lessons, I don't learn them easily, and sometimes it's a repeating pattern that I end up there again, just to make doubly sure that the universe is letting me know that I've learned it. So you're not alone. Sometimes it definitely takes us more than one go around.
Yeah, and I think speaking back to the boundaries, I learned so much in the aftermath of that. I didn't expect to be having this conversation here, but it's relevant to even the work situation, right? Where we hear a lot about people saying, oh, set healthy boundaries. And yet when you step back, you think, what does that really mean? A lot of us don't really even know what that means. And until then I kind of came across some resources where I really learned some new things about this variety, all these different range of types of boundaries. And it's a woman who's a coach for specific reasons, people going through particular hard times with particularly challenging people dealing with very challenging emotional disorders, which I realized that's what my partner had been. But when you start seeing, here's all these 7 different kinds of boundaries, and this is what it looks like when those get tread on, and you start seeing all these different things, and you're thinking, wow, here's all these different arenas in my life where I didn't ever think of them as boundaries. You're just navigating and trying to, be nice and get along and whatever. But when you start seeing that even things like time, when someone is really invading on your sense of time, where they won't honor, how you need to work, how you need to accomplish things, even though they want to, but they don't let you do it. A lot of little things, when you start learning how boundaries work, all of a sudden it just flips a switch, and you can see life very differently, and you can see your work very differently. And then you start seeing how boundaries play a role with your projects, how you manage your own time, how you deal with people, how you communicate. I started looking at it even from a customer experience perspective, and see, well, how are businesses really respecting what a customer, what a person as a normal human being, as a consumer out there living life. They've got all these emotional considerations. Only now, and maybe in the past couple of years, are we hearing that really talked about in CX, right? Even I remember trying to write blogs, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, and people I work with would be saying, well, I get it, but it's too touchy-feely. And now I can post those, and people are all over it. So It's really an interesting time in history in business, and especially COVID has had that impact, right? Where now business is the idea that you have to be much more empathetic in your communications and in the kind of experiences you deliver. That is just monster now, right? Where it just was barely a thing 4 years ago.
Yeah, I guess it's still not that well understood. So perhaps it still feels like a panacea we're yet to conquer in terms of CX and more broadly business, how empathy, I think it's been said for a long time, is the key to everything in CX, but we still can't quite put our finger on how it works. But just to reflect on a couple of points that you said there, really around boundaries, I think kind of taking us right back to the start of the conversation, when you feel a sense of a red flag going up or your intuition sparks, that is usually when somebody is crossing one of your boundaries, isn't it? Or like if they've done or said something that really kind of triggers a value of yours, and as you're like me, you're driven by your true north, your own set of purpose and values of so clear to you, you only want to work within for people who share those that sense of values and boundaries. I just have to ask like kind of a final question, really, because like I don't know how, as a woman of such strong principles right now, it must be hard living in Trump's America, and with the elections coming up soon. I hope you don't mind me treading into that space, but I'm curious, having not been in the States for a while, like how is that going? Like for someone who wants to spread love and being faced with so much hate, how are you kind of coping with that?
I have to, there's a lot I could say about it that I won't, but let's say for the past 4 years, it's been very painful, very embarrassing, very frustrating to be an American, and being a woman in America. But the flip side is it makes me that much more determined. Having had a narcissistic partner and really learning a lot about narcissistic abuse, it's that much more difficult for me to see what Trump's doing to our country, because I see that's what he gets away with. And a big part of it,
basically a narcissist is your president. Yeah.
And it's very frustrating, but I also learned the only way you ever deal with them, the only way to conquer them, is you ignore them. That's the only thing that, is cuts off their life's blood, basically. So it doesn't mean that I won't read the news. I do, but I won't watch anything about him. I don't engage in anything political about him. I'm really not going to put any energy into that. And instead, I'm going to focus on what I can change, which is me and how I deal with the world. Putting my energy into bringing my best game to my work, and my best game to my personal life, and looking at how I want to live my life. It's often I've put off doing a lot of overseas travel. I wanted to live and work overseas for a long time, and I put that off usually because of relationships. And then I was really going to kick it up a notch, being single again, and then COVID happened. So,
Oh yeah, because we started talking about that, didn't we, when we had our Zoom call? Because I've
right.
been doing my digital nomad thing for the last couple of years, and now I'm landlocked in England. But you've got the same dream too, haven't you?
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
living with this particular president, even if he
yeah.
wasn't president, I would still want it. But more than ever, you kind of wish that you could be living, in the outback of Australia or something, as far away from him as possible.
Yeah, no, I get you. So, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. But if you were to give some closing advice to the women in CX out there, what would your kind of key messages be for them?
Well, it would probably circle back to a lot of what we've talked about here, which is, never stop fighting the good fight. If your intuition says this is the right thing for the customer, and you're working with businesses who, they're very close to the business. These are good people that have good intentions, right? But they're usually too close to the business to see it from a customer's perspective. So your goal, your role is to always think like a customer and bring that to the table, keep bringing that to the forefront so people really can have an intimate understanding, an empathetic understanding of what it means to be the customer for that business, and what it's really going to take to make that an experience. And to remember that, people are having an experience whether you like it or not. It's going to be good, bad, or indifferent. And if it's bad, then you're going to lose them. If it's indifferent, then you're wide open to being swallowed up by competition. So it's only if it's good to exceptional are you going to keep customers. And if you keep reminding your clients of that, and using your intuition about what you know is the right thing for customers, I think maybe you have a chance to move the needle, because you can help them figure out how to work internally to make those little shifts, because a lot of times it's internal culture that's just not there yet. And, every little bit helps.
Yep, no, agree. That's awesome. Okay, well, thanks ever so much for being on the show. I hope things cool down in San Francisco. I really hope that you don't get any more wildfires. I know you've been worrying about that.
Well, thank you so much. I super appreciate you allowing me to contribute here. It's an awesome thing that you're doing here to get women's voice out there in CX.
Oh, it's been amazing to have you. So just like to say thank you to all the listeners. Please do join us again next week. I'll see you all soon. Bye for now. Bye, Gavin. Thanks for listening to the Women in CX podcast with me, Clare Muscutt. If you enjoyed the show, please drop us a like, subscribe, and leave a review on whichever platform you're listening or watching on. And if you want to know more, please join us at womenincx.community and follow the Women in CX page on LinkedIn. Tune in again next week to hear Hannah Foley talking about the story behind her business Yak CX, and the challenges of balancing her career with motherhood and the similarities with climbing Mount Everest. See you all next week.